All right. Making sure we have everyone on screen here. Welcome to the American Kinesiology Association's, I think we got a little lag here on somebody, but we got everyone in. There we go. Our next DEI seminar that we're talking about today, specifically, we are focusing on kind of fostering and creating a welcoming climate. And I'm here with the team from East Bay, which we'll introduce very quickly. And super excited about this topic. It's something that a lot of people have asked a few questions about because it led to actually winning the AKA's Inclusive Award back in 2021. I know we've had questions across asking kind of what's the process and getting through there, not just the technical process of how things are graded, but really what you do. And so kind of introducing everyone as best I can here. And if I miss any recognitions or accolades, please let me know. But we have Dr. Paul Carpenter here. Here is the department chair and helped create the working culture that helped lead to that winning that award. We have Dr. Missy Wright here as well, and Dr. Matthew Atencio, both of which are the co-directors for the Center of Sport and Social Justice. We also have Dr. Michael Rowley here, who is a biomechanist and deals with issues in minority dancing inclusivity. Also, I was told, leads up the White Anti-Racist Collective on campus. And then I was actually told that you guys recently have a new course on physics for inclusive dance. That's a combination of the departments of physics, dance, and kinesiology on campus. So that is absolutely amazing. And so I'm excited to have them here today. And with that being said, I have a few questions to ask for you guys as a panel. For those who are listening in, by all means, if you're listening in via X, formerly known as Twitter, for those who don't know the changeover, or Facebook or the YouTube, feel free to provide comments or questions in the comment section that feeds to me. I will post those up for them as we go along or at the end. Additionally, please feel free to, just send out your congrats or, support by all means. So with that in mind, my first question for you guys is, why invest the time and energy into DEI?
Well, I think that's going to be over to me to take the first stab at, but hopefully we'll do this as a collaborative effort. And if my colleagues here want to interject at any time, please feel free to do so. So first of all, I would like to thank you, Dan, for putting all this together, the technical aspects of this. It's much appreciated. And also to the AKA Diversity Committee for the invitation. We very much enjoyed getting that invitation and being able to share our work with you here. So thanks for that. I could start out this sort of saying with a term I've heard many, many times before, it's just the right thing to do. But it seems a little cliche to say that, and although it's perhaps a truism, I thought perhaps I started out to answer that question, try and go into things a little bit deeper to try and explore what some of our motives were. I think one of the things that sort of came out of this was the need or the recognition we need to be far more intentional in what we do. We need to be far more systemic in terms of what we do, consistent, and I think also sustainable. And that's become an issue. And I know we're going to get back to that question later on in this webinar as part of the sort of the future. But when I started to think about this, I tried to sort of come up with some sort of framework here, some structure to sort of give the answer to the question in terms of why invest the time and effort. I think there's an element here where you can look at this from a historical and a contemporary point of view. I can look at it from the local to the global, and then from the individual to the societal. Now, none of those are mutually exclusive, and they're all interconnected in many different ways. And I try and touch upon a few of them as we go through. So when I look at East Bay, I've been here now, this is my 10th year, but I've inherited a great department and a great culture with respect to DEI. There's a long history in terms of work in this area, this department. This is not something that started just a few years ago. It's been something that's been ongoing for many, many years. I think also if you look at where we're sort of geographically located in the East Bay is sort of, has been a hotbed of activism over the years. In terms of, you have Berkeley in the 60s, you have all the work that came out of San Jose State with the Olympic movement in 1968. I believe the Black Panthers were formed in the Oakland area. So you have a long history here. So we have that sort of foundation and culture. And I think a lot of people came to this area and to East Bay with that sort of history in the background there. So I think it's been something's embraced by the department. I think it's part of our DNA and goes back a long, long way. But I think what we started to realize was that it was perhaps an aspect that was sort of seen more as the purview of a group of individuals rather than maybe the collective department. So it was always there, but not necessarily deeply embedded. So again, I think, what you saw there was the Center for Sport and Social Justice evolved out of this. And I forget exactly when that was founded. Maybe Matt or Missy can refresh my memory, but it must have been 15, 20 years ago. It first got founded as a center here on campus. And so that has been the vehicle by which we've done a lot of DEI work. But I think when you start to look and see some of the societal changes that have taken place, some of the sort of global questions that have come up around DEI, then you can sort of throw in COVID as well to this mix. I think we sort of recognize we needed to be more, as I say, intentional and to embed this across the entire department. So rather than being the purview of one small group of people, it had to become something that each of us individually and collectively focused in on. So we really have embedded this in our mission and in our values. And we've just recently, re-upped those as well. We're just about to put a statement out on our website as to what those exactly are. But broadly speaking, it's very much about taking the perspective that sport should be for everyone, physical activity should be everyone, but with a recognition that sport in of itself can also create inequities and injustices, but it also can be a vehicle for change. So how do we go about that? But we have to sort of embed this deeply in everything that we do. And we have as a sort of central core part of what we do and who we are as social justice and equity. So that's driven through everything that's taken place here. But then you layer on a lot of things that are happening and happened in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, and also some things that have started to change. And in no particular order, we've seen major changes here on our campus for a couple of reasons. So we are one of the most diverse campuses in terms of student body in the continental USA. However, we've had a number of climate surveys that sort of indicate that a number of the minorities groups do not feel welcome on campus. And so we've had to sort of address that and deal with that. It's led to a lot of work being done by past presidents, but it's really been taken on by our new president, who I think is now in the job like 3 years. And so there's been a re-upping of that. We've got a new strategic plan in place, and that has sort of put DEI front and center. And it's sort of created a culture and environment where we really have to address that, because it's part and parcel of how we report annually on a number of different things, everything from program reports to now it's embedded in faculty evaluations. And it's also something that we have to report on to the president and the provost each year in terms of their progress towards those strategic imperatives and initiatives. We have a new dean, and our dean has really embraced this. He's changed this in a number of ways. And when we get to the future section, we will perhaps talk about a few things in terms of how that's impacting and how we may move ahead in the future as well. But again, tomorrow we have, Friday, we have our first Fridays, which our new dean has put in place, which is all DEI focused, and it's at the college level. So that's sort of changed the culture and the environment as well. And then you've got the system-wide things. So the CSU, California State University, largest system in the United States, 23 different campuses, 500,000 students. I forget the exact number of faculty and staff, but it's a huge system. But it's had its problems, and some of those problems have been around diversity and equity. And this came to a head a few years ago when we had the first system-wide Juneteenth symposium. And it laid out a number of areas where we were very deficient as a system, systemically, as well as individual campuses and individual programs. So a commitment was made by the Chancellor's office to address that and go front and center with that. So that's led to a number of sort of systemic changes in the system itself. And those things are still outplaying. And if you read the national higher education news outlets, you know the CSU has had a few issues and problems in recent years with presidents having to be let go, step down for issues related sometimes to DEI. But again, there's a whole culture shift there that's taking place. So that's sort of some of the external pressures that are sort of forcing us to change things. But the point I really want to highlight here is that this is really absolutely part of our DNA. As a department, this is what we do. This is sort of drives everything and how we organize things. And I think the other thing that's really kicked in here that's sort of led us to sort of be far more systemic with what we do is it's tied heavily to student success. So in terms of student success right now, we are very, very focused on DEI issues, because of the nature of the student body that we have, and also the increase in the amount of data that we get on a regular basis. So we get reported out every semester across the entire university, which everyone can see as public information, the DFW rates for every class that we teach. We can see what the equity gaps are. We can see where those issues are. And we are now, sort of mandated to address those and and deal with those issues. And so that's another part of why we've then taken this far more systemic approach and try to embed things far more deeply in what we do, everything from the curriculum, everything from the way in which we interact with the students, messaging that we do. And as we go through the rest of this webinar, I think we're going to get into the next questions in terms of some of the specifics of what we've done and how successful they've been. And then later on, some of the challenges that we've had to overcome and some of the things we see potentially down the road here as things that we have to address. So I think that hopefully provides a context to where we are and ask the question. So I think there's an element here where, yes, there's some external pressures on us that we need to put the time and effort into this. We have to. It's part of the way the system has mandated things are. But for us, that's just an artifact of what we already do. We're already wedded to this particular approach. We very much have this as part of, I say, as our DNA, and we have a long history of doing this. And so to some degree, I think we're ahead of the game. And in fact, in some cases, we're pointed to as a model on campus with respect to some of the things that we've done and the work that we do. So I don't know if Matt, Missy, Michael have anything to add to that, or whether that's sort of a good foundation to at least give you some context for what we're going to present in the rest of this session. Happy to answer any questions if they're thrown into the chat.
I'll throw in one other piece here. This is also maybe a cliche phrase you've heard before, but diversity is excellence, right? So, and that's, more than just a cliche phrase. There's lots of evidence for that, right? More diverse companies make more money. More diverse learning environments have better learning outcomes. And so, we keep that front and center. We never take the view that trying to make our department more diverse or more inclusive is degrading our excellence in any way. No, it's actually like required to be excellent and enhance our excellence. So yeah, we keep that front and center, and that diversity is not just about recruitment, right? When it comes to faculty, staff, and students, it's also about retention. And so we're focusing on all those pieces.
Thanks, Michael. Can't hear you, Dan.
I didn't notice it when I popped on and took off my mic. So I'm going to jump to the next question, but we did have a question come in through Facebook that was asking specifically on something you just commented on, Dr. Carpenter. I'm going to put it in because I think whether you answer it directly right now or as part of this question that you guys are going into, it fits along the same lines. So the question that was asked from the chat, all right, that will play a role with what we have going on, is the question from Janet Branchall, Dutch, was, how does the system hold a department and course responsible for addressing gaps in DFW rates? What kind of interventions are you implementing to address the identified gaps? And I know we're getting ready to talk about initiatives you guys put into place, but I don't know if you're going to address it through that. If not, I was just going to have it there to be mindful. I can also put the question back up so you can, because it's a two-part question. So
I can jump in here too. At East Bay, it's a pretty amazing place to be working at. We have so many different initiatives and programs that you can get involved with, and sometimes you can even get some funding for participating in. One example that comes to mind is the Anti-Racist Liberatory Pedagogy Academy, short form to ARLPA, which doesn't really roll off the tongue that well. But that's a university-wide program that is offered intensively in the summer for 4 days, and then you'd meet throughout the year. And in those programs, I participated in, I think there's 12 of us this last summer, and 4 of the 12 were from the kinesiology department, which is, people are making note of that. And that's not something that is rare around campus. People comment how the kinesiology department is really involved in social justice and DEI, JEDI programs. But yeah, things like this, anti-racist syllabus, there's so many different things that we're learning that we're directly being able to put into play. So it's not just sort of this lip service. But yeah, it is hard. How does the system hold a department course responsible for addressing that? I think Paul does a good job with us too, in terms of the department, not being like, what does this one course need to do better? But it's more of this reflection piece of reflect on, like, what are some practices you're doing? How maybe if you changed in the last few years, what have been some things that have worked or haven't worked? So it's not necessarily this onus of that one class needs to get better, but it's really sort of, let's look at this department wide and how can we work to address this and look at it more of as a collective.
Yeah, I think to build on the observation Missy made there, not only do we have a lot of initiatives that are programs campus level, we also have some at the system level. So I was fortunate to spend a year in the Middle Leadership Academy with a group of colleagues from this campus and other campuses, where we specifically try to address how can we actually help faculty interpret the data. So you have all this data that gets out there that presents your DFW rates and exactly, what does that mean? So we actually put together a team to sort of address that, to be able to provide the interpretive aspect of the data, because the numbers, sometimes if you look at it absolute versus percentage, you get a very, very different picture. And again, it's looking at things in terms of over a more longer term. So not just isolating in one semester, but over the course of a year or a term. And in fact, there are data now that faculty can get where they can actually get, for the entire time they've taught at East Bay, the DFW rates, the equity gaps for the students they've had in their classes, the number of students they've taught, the ethnic breakdown, everything else. And again, and armed with some information about how to interpret the data, how to interpret the numbers, they're better positioned to perhaps then take a look at things. But we've been encouraging people, as Missy mentioned, we've gone through syllabi, we've changed the syllabi out to make them more amenable, and to try and avoid issues with respect to sort of creating a climate which isn't welcoming through the syllabus. We've also had a lot of conversations about how can we sort of look at assessment and the way in which we assess, because assessment comes down in terms of how that is. We found there's been a huge amount of inequity there in terms of that. And just changing assessment practices, we found that that's what has helped with the DFW rates as well. So we're continuing to sort of focus on those sorts of things, and we continue to move things. Things have shifted quite a bit with COVID and the move to a lot of classes online, and we've still not fully come out of the online environment. And so we still have some questions around that in terms of how that plays out, with particularly with equity gaps because of issues around access to resources from online, depending upon, some of their students at East Bay are food challenged as well as housing insecure. So that sort of created another backdrop to this as well. So you also have to sort of look at the context for these courses as well, and look at the broader aspects of this. But how people interpret the data is the first step. I think most people then, with that information, can actually self-reflect in their course and start to sort of see where they may be able to do some improvements. But it's working through a number of different things.
I'll throw in two more quick things there, Dan, if that's right. Seeing the DFW rates, understanding what that means, and then reflecting with support, sort of like Missy was mentioning, from all these trainings that are offered CSU wide and on our campus. One in particular I want to talk about is a great grading faculty learning community that happened last year that looked at different assessment practices, like Paul mentioned, and particularly looked at alternative grading strategies like contract-based grading, ungrading, criteria-based grading. And if you leave with one piece on there, one thing I think is really interesting to reflect on is when I looked at my courses and my syllabi and how many points in the final grade were based on compliance, like it got in on time, or you formatted it the right way, or and is that really what I want their final grade to be based on, right? Compliance or learning. So, things like that, going to these trainings, having these conversations department-wide, and reflecting on how our grades and our assessments are really structured.
Excellent. So with that being said, I know you were directly answering that question and it covered some of this, but were there other initiatives put in place that you felt made a big difference?
Matt, I wonder if you want to take this. You took the lead with putting us forward for the AKA award and really driving that. I wonder if you want to speak to that process
Sure.
a bit.
So, going back to the last question, the second part of that last question, thinking about what kinds of interventions or initiatives have been helpful in addressing, things like the DFW rates, and which my colleagues have spoken about at length. But I think one of the strengths of the hallmarks of our department are the co-curricular programs that we have. And when I was putting together the award letter or proposal, if you will, I was really struck by the amount of different programs that we've got that are aimed at getting students involved in research, getting involved in community organizations that are in our backyard here in the Bay Area that we can plug into and develop partnerships and internships and volunteer opportunities. So I think that's maybe kind of when I looked at the breadth of things that we do that's quite unique to our department, I think it really is one of the strengths is the research side and getting students involved in that, but also the programming that we're able to do and connecting the campus with the local community. And just maybe going back to the very first question, a bit of the contextualization. I do think that maybe it wasn't something that we thought we were going to learn, but I think by going through the award proposal process, it really was a neat way of sort of looking at the entire context of our department, but also looking at the range of different things that maybe we didn't even know about at the time. And, in this room, you've got, 4 people with different types of expertise in kinesiology. And you can imagine with a larger department, the amount of projects and work that's being done. I do think that was maybe an unintentional but positive consequence of going through this process was seeing the amount of initiatives, the range of things that are being done, whether it's the natural sciences, humanities, psychology, et cetera, et cetera. And it really speaks to the raft of things that we're doing in the department.
Yeah, and I'll keep on going with that with the CSSJ, some of the programs that we've put together, the podcast series. So sort of transitioning from being in person to, okay, now what do we want to do? Putting podcast series together. So we're getting people from the local community as well as scholars from around the country being able to speak to specific topics, things like even on our campus, the Pioneer mascot, and being able to bring that up and talk about that in sort of a critical conversations and having, again, scholars from around the country talking about those sort of things. So sort of bringing in a national perspective to something that's also local or a national lens too. Speakers, Matt talked a lot about what we're able to do with our bringing people into the classroom, really leveraging our local community and the amazing programs that people are doing there. And then also Michael's work too, I've been here now for 10 years. It's about maybe 3 years ago, we started the White Anti-Racist Collective, a university-wide initiative. And Michael jumped in on that in maybe his first year or second year, and is now the leader of it. And I'm helping sort of co-lead. So just, again, different initiatives that are either university-wide, college-wide, or department, and we're taking the lead, it's fun. And when there's other people there too from your department, it's always it's always a nice thing to see friendly faces and doing good work.
And I'll throw something in about the physics of inclusive dance class you mentioned in the intro there, Dan. We're talking about collaborating with outside groups and inside groups and departments and colleges. I think this is a really good example of sort of leveraging something that's already happening that's really cool in a different department. Our theater and dance department, one of the professors in that department, Eric Coopers, does some phenomenal work on inclusive dance, which, if you don't know what that refers to, it typically specifically refers to people with different abilities dancing. So whether they're wheelchair users or whether they have a different number of limbs, or they use some assistive aid, or they have some invisible disability. This is inclusive dance. So we're looking at physics of dance. We collaborated with a physics professor as well to create this class, and kind of applying it to people with very different shaped and different looking bodies, and people who use different mobility aids. And so that's really, we're taking our expertise in kinesiology and putting on this sort of biomechanics lens, but it's really a collaboration with the theater and dance department, who's already been doing this great work on accessibility and inclusive dance.
Yeah, a couple of other things that I'll add that we've sort of briefly touched upon already. So, the new dean implemented the First Fridays, which is very much focused on DEI issues. But I think the fascinating thing about that, at least from my perspective as the chair, is that the dean's also made a real push to sort of note that the people who support that most of all are from our department. And in fact, most of the sessions that have been put together by Michael, who has chaired the group that sort of led that group, the strategic planning committee for the college. So although it may not be our initiative, I feel it is, because we're the ones that have been driving it, because we're doing a lot of work in this area. We mentioned earlier, we had a group come in and give us sort of input and feedback to try and change their syllabi. We've taken a look at that. We've just gone through and completed last year our 5-year program review. And as part of that, we've taken a look at our curriculum. We've taken a look at all of the practices, and we have in place a 5-year plan now to sort of build upon the initiatives we already have that have been spoken about in terms of moving us forward. I think another one as well, and maybe Missy and Michael can talk to this, because along with Jenny O, you are the co-publishers, and that's the Workload Initiative. I think that's one that's also got quite a bit of traction from what I can tell, and interest from other people in AKA. So both of you want to talk about that one as an initiative?
Sure. So Dr. Jenny O is part of AKA. She and I are associate co-chairs of the kinesiology department. And one of our main things is looking at service. And so who's doing service in the department, and maybe what other service are they doing in the university. But there's, certain department and college level service that has to be done. And what we were finding is that it was the same people that were typically volunteering or over volunteering and joining committees. And so one thing that we did was come up with this Google sheet. And so taking feedback from our department members of what service do they like, what would they like to do, and then just sort of coming up with this list of, all right, then here's a committee that you can join. How does that sound? Instead of sort of depending on that old model of waiting for people to volunteer and having, maybe we had one person volunteer for 5 different committees, thinking that maybe they're not doing enough. So yeah, we presented that at AK Leadership last year, and that went over very well. We got a lot of follow-up emails to share that document and that process. And so hopefully, and we just wrote a paper that highlights that, a part of that too, for the AKA kinesiology review that should be coming out soon. Giving a plug for that as well. And Michael, is there anything else you want to add to that process?
No, I think you summarized it well. Just to say that I think it was a really cool example of like making these changes in the way our department looks at service work, and also kind of just keeping track of them and thinking about them and turning that into a presentation and a paper, kind of doing like this scholarship and action at the same time, which I think was really cool.
And Matt, do you want to briefly talk about our work with the Soccer Without Borders group? I think that's
sure, Paul.
A really powerful one.
Absolutely. And in the chat, I want to put a link to the Center for Sport and Social Justice. I know we've talked a bit about it, but it is a group of faculty, students, nonprofit leaders in our local community, but also nationally. We've been at Cal State East Bay since 2012, and we've done over 25 major awareness events. And one of the consistent annual projects that we do is working with an organization called Soccer Without Borders. Soccer Without Borders is based in Oakland, but now has a national and global reach, serving newcomer and immigrant youth that come to this country and are looking for academic support, social emotional support, as well as playing the world's game of soccer. So we've had many collaborations with Soccer Without Borders over the years. We've had them on our campus, looking at maybe as a pathway for many young people in high schools in our local area. So we introduce them to, faculty members, staff members, our students, student athletes. And we've had a really neat annual game where we've had maybe 60, 70 young people come, a lot of staff, and a lot of coaches. And we've got kind of a end of the year celebration on our campus. So, making use of the facilities and some of the things that we can do on our campus, but really highlighting the amazing work that's being done in the local community. And I know later on we'll talk about maybe some challenges perhaps, but maintaining these relationships is really vital to the work that we do, and getting our students involved in meeting these young people and learning from community pedagogies and ways of working with young people has been a win-win for everyone.
Excellent. And thank you for sharing that link with me, Matt. I was able to go ahead and send that out. That went out through, for people who want that link, it went out through the Facebook. So if you're in the comment section of Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, you should be able to see that link. Just post it to all 3 of those, and you can click and follow it without an issue. With that, before I move on to the next question, do you guys have any other comments to this question, or would you like me to go ahead and move on?
I think we can move on.
All right, good, because the next one gets a little harder. So let's talk about it. What were the successes, challenges, and pitfalls in relation to this?
Well, maybe I'll kick it off with one, because I sort of enjoy this one at one level. But so we've had a lot of conversations with the new president about how we rebrand the campus, how we reposition the campus. There's been a conversation about East Bay being the hidden gem in the East Bay. But one of the questions that have come up time and time again is about the use of Pioneer. So a few years ago, there was a whole review of this, And they did away with the Pioneer mascot, which was Pioneer Pete, which basically looked like Yosemite Sam. And there was a lot of aspects of that which were highly problematic. And so that was removed, but the Pioneer term wasn't. And as a department, we felt quite strongly about the use of Pioneer, as students were very opposed to the use of the term. So we went ahead and we dropped it from every aspect of any messaging that we have in our department. And we even put a presentation together. Michael's been very involved in this, as is Dr. Becky Bill. And we're still in the process of the new president looking at rebranding. But athletics has decided that they do not want to give up the Pioneer brand. And we share facilities with athletics. So in some senses, it's very hard for us to get away from the term Pioneer, because half of the messaging that's in this building that we're in has Pioneer. So that's sort of been an interesting challenge in terms of how do you navigate that one. And right now, we don't really have a good feel for where the new branding exercise will go and exactly how that will play out. I know Michael's trying to be reaching out to the president as I to sort of get a conversation going with to be part of that group, but we're not sure. And there's a real mix of attitudes and opinions around that aspect of the Pioneer brand. It's a little bit like a few years ago when we moved from being CSU Haywood to CSU East Bay. There were a number of folks that weren't happy with that sort of change. And I think there's a long history again here of the use of Pioneer, and it has multiple meanings, but there is also a very, very strong connection to a very adverse way to sort of see that particular use of the term. And then when you layer that on the work that's been done on this campus around the Native American land that we're on and land acknowledgements and this sort of work, and the whole issue of complying with legislation to return Native American artifacts, the Pioneer sort of sticks out as a problem. So that's sort of become not so much a success for us in terms of being able to sort of remove that term from campus-wide, although we have removed it from the department, but it's also been a real challenge and a little bit of a pitfall in terms of trying to figure out and navigate the politics around that on campus. So I don't know if Michael wants to take it from there any further.
Yeah, I'll just kind of add a few things to that. This is my third year in the department, and Pioneer Pete, specifically the mascot, was retired, I guess, about 4 or 5 years ago, just before I got here. So when I arrived, I was able to, play dumb a little bit. Well, I wasn't playing. I really didn't know the history. And so I was asking around and talking to our university diversity officer and kind of learning about what happened when this mascot was retired. And as part of that process, I got a hold of the recordings from some town halls that were held while that decision was being made. And it was really eye-opening for me to see some of the ways that the brand impacted students. I'll just want to share one really briefly. A student was with a group that was doing some work with Native American tribes, traveling to reservations and doing some work. And on one of these trips, all the students were wearing Pioneer shirts, right? And they were told that they were making everybody uncomfortable, and it was creating a lot of issues. Because for these people who are on reservations, they were pushed there by pioneers, essentially, right? And so they ended up all taking off their East Bay shirts for the remainder of this service trip. And so, those are kind of the impacts. I think we all might have individual opinions about what Pioneer means to us, but we need to look at what the impacts are and how other people see it too, because that's how we're viewed. So yeah, I think one thing that has been a pitfall, if we're using that word, is like, how hard do we want to push this? And in the politics of it, like, right? If our department power university wide only goes so far, where do we want to really push issues? And so we've been trying to keep the conversation alive. And I think the rebranding process, I'm optimistic that by keeping the conversation alive, it's in the forefront and it'll be part of the rebranding conversation.
I'll go ahead and jump in here and maybe speak, going back to the community outreach and relationship building piece to that. So both Missy and I are the co-directors of the CSSJ, and one of the things that we've had to contemplate, we've actually written about this as well, is the way that we develop sustainable relationships with these amazing groups that we work with. And I always phrase it in these terms that, we're quite rich in human capital. We have a lot of students with amazing backgrounds and interests, We have, dedicated colleagues on the faculty side. We've got great partners that are doing amazing, innovative work out in the community, in the local area. So in terms of that human capital, we're quite rich, but, and I know this will come up later on in the conversation, but in terms of funding, economics, social networks that are quite rich in capital, I feel like that's always the challenge, as you mentioned. The challenge that we face is, people sometimes look at us and say, "Oh, you're from the university and you've got tons and tons of resourcing and you can do lots of things for us, and we want to partner with you." And sometimes it's sort of the opposite, where we find that when we work with groups like Positive Coaching Alliance, PCA, or local professional sport teams like the Oakland Roots, which is quite a progressive grassroots pro soccer team in the area, that they are the actual ones that have most of the capital, if you will, and we just have some ideas, good ideas for partnerships and events and research, and so I think that's kind of maybe a big question for us moving forward, and our own project at the CSSJ is, how do we keep things moving when the context, which keeps coming up in this conversation, is it's not the best in terms of the economic side of things. So Missy, I don't know if you want to add on to that, but I do feel like that comes up quite a bit in our work right now.
Yeah. And just the example you brought up with the Positive Coaching Alliance, and their interest in doing some research out in the community and how great that would be. But we also run into, we don't have the infrastructure that sort of exists that helps us navigate that missing link of like, okay, they want this, we can provide this, how do we make this sort of happen? And that can sometimes be that stopping point. We have students that want to be involved, but I think it's tough we only see them sort of those last 2 years. So like Paul was talking about with the online, still a lot of our students are taking online. We don't see as many back in person. That's starting to change, but how to get that student engagement starting maybe from early in their junior year and getting involved in these projects, and how enriching that is, or just sort of the hurdles that it takes to get all those things lined up and happening.
Yeah, Missy, I think capacity is a really appropriate phrase for that. Capacity building for the fuel, if you will, that will kind of engine these kinds of initiatives that we've identified is certainly a challenge for the CSSJ.
I think for me, a big success is that I think increasingly we see the entire department embracing this, and everyone sees the importance and value of this. And we have, I think, far richer conversations now than maybe a few years ago around these sorts of issues as part of our core values and what we do. So I see that as a huge success. I think a real challenge for us, and sort of Matt and Missy have already alluded to this, is around resourcing. So again, a part of the context here at Cal State East Bay and the CSU system, the teaching load is 4 3-unit classes per term. So the teaching load is very, very high. And so that then creates sort of challenges from the point of view of the capacity that we have to deal with these particularly the outreach programs. We can certainly try and embed these into the curriculum, but even then, when you're teaching 4 3-unit classes each term, that's a pretty heavy teaching load. And then to try and then layer on top of that, asking people to completely revamp their syllabus, completely change their curriculum, revisit their assessment practices, that then becomes a huge heavy lift. And how you go about trying to sort of encourage people to do that when it can be challenging from the point of view of we don't have the capacity to actually provide a sort of a stipend to do that. Now and again, we can provide a little bit of extra resource, but the thing that we have a struggle with is providing the time. Time is the most valuable resource, which we have so little of. So I think, that's where you have to get then strategic about which of these things that you do. And I think there's where some of the pitfalls also come in, because not everyone's on the same page, which perhaps is the number 1 priority versus the number 2 versus the number 3. And so navigating that, I think, is where you get another challenge as well, and where you just have to keep the conversation, the dialogue going. And we've been pretty good, I think, the last few years, even during COVID, that we would have, at least 1 or 2 retreats a year where we'd have these sorts of issues front and center. We'd have a very focused retreat on dealing with things, come up with action plans. And I think that's been a success as well, identifying that and following through on the plans that we have. If they just don't sit there, we actually do action them.
Excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and throw up our last question kind of that we have for you guys before we move into the Q&A. And that's really the broad concept of what does the future hold? I mean, what are the plans to continue this work that you're doing?
I think the context that we're in is that we have to keep doing this work because there's a compliance issue to it. Whilst it's not the best reason for doing it, that certainly is there. We have to sort of address that with it, whether it's now faculty having to present their DEI focus in their annual evaluations, whether it's part of their annual program reviews, whether it's part of their reporting to the president and the provost. So that holds to the future. We're going to have to continue that. But as I said earlier, that's not a big deal for us because it's things that we've been doing. We can easily step into that and provide the information that's being requested. So I think, the future is going to be a case of far more scrutiny in terms of these sorts of issues. And I think there's going to be some very interesting conversations. Just to sort of give a context and to highlight one, I suspect some of you are aware that California passed legislation a few years ago that prevented us from traveling to certain states on statewide dollars. That legislation just got repealed, but it led to a very interesting conversation that led to the repeal about whether or not that type of approach is actually effective in addressing DEI issues or whether it's actually counterproductive. And I think that's sort of an interesting dialogue here that we're sort of starting to see in terms of exactly what initiatives do you push forward, given that there are always going to be sort of pros and cons. And sort of how do you navigate some of that? So I think part of the future is we have a new diversity officer just appointed to campus. We're not entirely sure yet what that plan will be and how that will play out. So there's a degree of uncertainty there. As I said earlier, the system is sort of undergoing some transition now. We have a new chancellor about to start. And again, we're not sure what that will mean for the push of DEI. I can't see it being reduced, but it may come with a slightly different focus. So again, it's the ability to pivot, to change, but to keep true to our identity, true to that DNA. I keep saying that, but I think that's critical for us to keep focused on what our core values are and what our mission is, and it is around DEI.
Yeah, and I think that goes back maybe to one of like the pitfalls or one of the challenges that we have is that student assessment. And I think that's something in the future that we'd love to get better at and like even learning where our students are going and how they're using this. This is one of our program learning outcomes is social justice and one of those harder things to measure. I think that's something that we like to put some energy towards and to get maybe a little bit more data around how effective are some of these initiatives with our students.
Yeah, Matt talked about this earlier as well. And another factor here is how we can sustain these efforts. I've already talked about the pressures of workload and how many things are being placed upon faculty. So how do we sustain these efforts? Sometimes what we get is some upfront resourcing to sort of prime pump these things, but then that money goes away. And as a result, we're left there with a great program, a great initiative, but how do we sustain it? How do we keep it moving forward? So I know there's been some conversations. I know I've had these with Matt. Matt and I have met with a few folks from our extension about how we can start to sort of look at ways to fund some of these initiatives that may be creative. And I think that's going to be an aspect of it. And Matt's talked about that a little bit already. And I know I'm not putting you on the spot here, but you want to talk a little bit about that and some of the conversations that we've had around that?
Sure, Paul. And again, I'll maybe bring it back to the work that we're doing with the CSHA is I'll give you a good example. We've never charged for the outreach events that we've hosted and that we've created in our history since 2012. But as we move into new times, we need to think about these things. Can we create workshops or summits with coaches, with other academics, with youth sport leaders in our community, and can we create these kind of leaner, maybe meaner type of projects that we can maybe monetize again? And as part of that sustainability push, which is just part of the landscape that we're in at this time. We've talked about maybe moving some things online, creating some modules. Some of this could be built into certification programs or curricular type things that we can institutionalize within our program and our learning outcomes. But I think it's really at this time and thinking about the future, trying to be creative and maybe thinking about, the core of what we've done. We've got a good track record, but can we maybe move the pieces around a little bit differently and repackage things online or face-to-face to address DEI issues in our community, but do them maybe in different ways, and ways that might be more sustainable.
All right. We do have a few questions for you guys. So let me go ahead and pop in those, unless there's anything else. Anyone want to add anything else before I switch over?
Go to Q&A. Sounds good.
All right. Well, the first one's more of a comment than a Q&A, but we had Ann Cox give a shout out there to you guys. Also appreciate, thank you, Missy, for doing this, and thank you guys all for hosting this. So now I'll jump back into the questions. And so we had Nicole Dabbs ask a question about how do you collect co-curricular items in your department to better understand the scope of what everyone's doing?
Okay, I try and interpret the question that Nicole has provided. How do we collect co-curricular items in the department? So we don't really have a formal mechanisms by which we actually collect all this or keep track of this in some sort of central spreadsheet. I think we have a fairly intuitive idea of the sort of umbrella titles to programs. So, we have the Center for Sport Social Justice, we have the Kinesiology Research Group, we have a Get Fit, Stay Fit program, we have our Exercises Medicine program. We also have, under each of those, certain types of projects that take place. So partly under the KRG, we have a program that is working with the aphasia group on campus here. It's providing fitness routines for them. We have another group that's worked with some of their local retirement communities, and there have been projects around that as well. And then with the Exercises Medicine, we've done outreach work on campus with respect to opportunities for staff, students, and faculty to get involved in exercise, and the same through our Get Fit, Stay Fit program, which is our in-house fitness program that's mainly for staff. So we have those as we know they exist, we know they do work, and we collate that. The institution has pulled some of that data, and we've actually input that as part of one of the institutional learning outcomes around teamwork, leadership. And so some of that gets fed into that, but it's very, very high level. It doesn't sort of tease out the specifics of the program. The KRG has over the years tried to do some assessment to sort of pinpoint whether or not students being involved in that particular program, whether it actually positively impacts their overall GPA, time to graduation. And, we found that that's actually a pretty good indicator, and there's evidence that it does. And it helps better prepare them in terms of whether they want to pursue later on going on into a master's program. So I don't know if that answers your question, Nicole, but that is in essence the way that this particular aspects work. We were not required at the institutional level to provide evidence of that, but we do often provide that as exemplars to highlight aspects of annual program reviews. We certainly highlighted that as part of their 5-year program review.
I'll throw in one more piece there, Paul, which I think kind of related. We about 2 years ago, we started a new sort of structure for our department meetings. And we have an agenda skeleton that gets filled in each time we meet. And there's space in that skeleton for every co-curricular group to make a report, give an update, et cetera. So even if it's empty one week, that's fine, but I think having that list and devoting the space, at least in our regular department meetings, is important for keeping those things front and center.
I just add a piece to that too. I think the question can also be framed in terms of the future and looking ahead and collecting, but also reflecting upon the different initiatives that we have. And I think that's maybe one of the legacies of doing the AKA, the DEI word proposal, was the amount of things and the breadth of things that we do that maybe we don't discuss or reflect upon, or for instance, how we conceptualize DEI across different disciplines within our department. So I do think that, moving forward, that this has maybe been a catalyst to think about the ways in which we work, maybe similarly, but also differently through our different co-curricular programs, maybe one for the future.
All right. I know we've got 2 questions left. I'm going to go ahead and answer. If for some reason anyone needs to take off, feel free. But they're great questions, so I think they should be asked. One is by Janet Branshaw. She's asking, how do individual faculty respond to the achievement gap data in their course? How do you ensure that they are not threatened but feel supported to address any issues that are revealed?
I think, initially this was very much seen as a threat. But I think a combination of conversations at the institutional level, again, going through these processes where we started to look at how to interpret the data and to sort of look at this in a more meaningful way. It was another data point to look at, because everyone in this department, at least, is good at reflecting on their courses and reviewing them, revising them, and taking a look and seeing where there maybe needed to changes. So I think some of that, the threat as well, sort of did come from, there were concerns from the union. We're a unionized institution. They were concerned that this would be used then as leverage by the administration. That hasn't been the case. There are certain things that are built in terms of who can see what. So, the data you get as an individual faculty member, that's not disclosed. The collective data, the summative data, is not disclosed to administrators. There are no names on the courses that are out there in the public domain, but it's not difficult to figure out because you can cross-reference to other databases to find that information. So I think there's an initial response from faculty that sort of, it sort of hits you in the heart because you feel like you've done everything in your course. But I think then people take a deep breath. We start to talk about, okay, well, what may be going on here? What are some of the qualitative comments that we're getting? What was your perception of what happened in the class? Can we take a look at this and can we sort of see things? And we also pour this out. And actually, if you unpack this a little bit, one of the biggest problems with our data is that it subsumes a couple of different categories that can end up being constituted as a fail when they're not. So, again, it confounds a D into the mix as well. But in many cases, a D is still a pass in many of our courses for moving forward. It isn't necessarily, an evidence or indication that there's an issue. And then again, depending upon whether or not an instructor has actually correctly identified a non-attending student and the way they've classified that in the grade roster, that can make it look as though there's a problem. And in general, when you start to unpack it and move away from the percentage aspect of this and start to look at it more in sort of absolute terms, then you can start to sort of see that maybe this isn't as a major issue, but there's something here that's worth taking a look at. And again, we do provide the support in terms of there are all these different trainings that you can go on and take part in. There are, we also align people within the department, so we get people who are teaching the same course to talk to each other, and then sort of to share and swap notes about how they proceeded, and to take a look at this. And when you actually sort of unpack this data, it can be sort of interesting from the point of view of an instructor teaching multiple sections of the same class, because you may have bad DFW rates in one, and by bad, it means that's 20% of the total grades in the class. Yet in the other 4 classes, not an issue, not a problem. So how do you unpack that? So again, obviously the person is doing something right somewhere here, and it just may be an anomaly. So again, it's this looking over time as well. Are we consistently seeing a pattern of, as opposed to we just don't look at this at one point in time. It's a case of looking at the rest of it. I think that helps soften things. But I think initially, yes, the reaction is, I have the same reaction when I look at mine. It's like, whoa, God, what did I do wrong here? But then stepping back and saying, well, okay, this is the data. Okay, let's interpret it. Let's see whether or not there is something to be learned from this.
I'll chime in with maybe a little bit of a different perspective, being a new faculty member, right? So this data was available from day one when I started at Cal State East Bay. And so, I'm coming in, fresh out of my training, my education. And so, I didn't necessarily have some of these conceptions that I know that a lot of faculty who've been teaching a long time have, because I'm coming in assuming I'm not doing a very good job to start. so I appreciate having this information, every semester to kind of continue to know how it's going and to tweak and fine tune. And I'll just answer Paul's question about multiple sections. The section with the high DFW rates is the one right after lunch. That's what
So I have one last question, and I think it's a good one to ask. And that is the question from Jason. And his question is how would you at least make a recommendation on implementing DEI initiatives when you're in a state that's not supported? And it's led from everything from DEI language being moved from job descriptions, mission statements, anything covering any form of promotion or website, upper administrations being highly scrutinized by anything that might involve DEI. Faculty buy-in is non-existent because you don't have to answer for having DEI. That's for many people in the field. This is several states are facing this issue. So, any thoughts?
Yeah,
I would jump in and say that there's a lot of things we've talked about, initiatives, especially I'm thinking about assessment and grading, that are not, like, when I talk about contract-based grading or ungrading, I don't really talk about like the underrepresented minority student DFW equity gap, right? Like that, those kinds of changes to assessment and grading are good for everybody. It's better for learning. It's better for developing intrinsic motivation in students, you know? So I think take a look at all the things we've talked about over the last hour, and you might be surprised if you think about each one, how few actually would be kind of like seen as affirmative action, you know, how few are actually targeting underrepresented minorities, and how many are good for everybody, increasing learning, you know. And so I would kind of try to adopt that lens when the language of, you know, helping certain groups is scrutinized or penalized. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, it's a real challenge, and I don't know that I have any good answer to it. And we're quite fortunate, I think, to be in a state that's pretty liberal from that perspective. But I think, you know, the focus that we really have sort of come to here, that's, I think, pulled people together, is the focus on student success, all student success. So sort of taking that as a framework, what do we need to do, put in place, whether it's the curriculum, whether it's support programs that will lead to student success. And so framing that, I think it's sort of hard to push back against the notion of you're looking to sort of university improve student graduation rates, improve student learning. And whether or not that will be enough traction, given that I think this is a highly politicized push in many of those states that have this sort of legislation on the table. And it's certainly, I forget what the number is in terms of, was it 60, 70 different pieces of legislation across different states in the US pushing against DEI initiatives. And again, some of the creative stuff that people do is to sort of change names of things, reframe things slightly in terms of the language that's used. And maybe that does make a difference. But I think, you know, Michael said a lot of things here that are universal to student success. And I think that's the focus that I would try and take if I was in that position. I'm not going to say it's going to be successful, but I think that would be one approach that I might suggest.
Absolutely. And for any more information on that legislation as it changes, although it's been 2 months, we did have an AKA webinar on that specific topic of legislation, DEI, 2 months ago with Dr. Brian Culp. You can go back and watch that on YouTube and Facebook. I thought it does a great job at working with this here. I know we're kind of coming to the close. Big shout out. Thank you for all you guys who have comments. I know we have several of our speakers who also have to go to their next thing. So we're going to go ahead and close out now. Thank you all, part of the AKA family. We appreciate it. Thank you all, speakers, and thank you, East Bay, for doing such a wonderful job. So you guys have been amazing.
Thank you. Thanks you. Appreciate taking the time to put all this together. Thanks to my colleagues here. Absolutely. Thanks to everyone out there in the internet land.
Definitely. Take care, everyone. Closing down now. Until next time.
Thanks.